Chapter 10. Christian Polygamy in the 16th Century. Among the distinguished Christian reformers and celebrated divines of the 16th century, may be mentioned the names of Luther, Melanchthon, Bucer, and Melanchthon. These wonderful men distinguished themselves in their persevering, bold, and fearless opposition to the corrupt powers of Catholicism. Although not called and ordained of God with the authority of apostles and prophets to restore the Church of God to the earth, yet they were reformers and, with a noble energy and perseverance, exposed, in a degree, the superstitions and wickedness of the Romish Church. They protested against their blasphemous doctrines and pretensions. They revolted from the jurisdiction and tyrannical power of the Romish priesthood. They weakened its corrupting influence among the nations. They laid the foundation of more liberal principles, opened the way for the nations to burst the bonds of religious despotism, and planted the seeds of civil and religious liberty, which have continued to grow and spread until millions now bask under the extended branches. It was for these great and noble purposes that God moved upon the hearts of these men to boldly protest against a power that had become tyrannical and formidable to an alarming degree. It was to restore, in some small degree, that freedom and independence of mind, so necessary to the improvement and happiness of man. It was to open a door for advancement in the sciences and arts without being trammeled with the bigoted opposition of priestcraft. Though they were raised up to accomplish these great and desirable purposes, yet they could not restore the Church of God to the earth, for this was not their calling. They were called to lay the foundation of a reformation, which should eventually terminate in the establishment of governments favorable to liberty of conscience, that when the Church should be restored, men might be free to embrace its principles. They and their successors who have followed in their steps, were called as forerunners to prepare the way before the Church, when it should once more have place on the earth. These celebrated reformers advocated Christianity so far as they understood its principles. Many Romish superstitions which had been palmed upon the world for Christianity, were abolished. Many Christian institutions which had been abolished by the Romish priesthood were, in a measure, restored, at last in form, among which may be mentioned polygamy. The Romanists had not only forbidden marriage to her priests, but had abolished the divine institution of polygamy, which was practiced in early ages when pure Christianity was on the earth. While polygamy flourished in the Christian Church, the Roman nation were in favor of monogamy or the one-wife system, and established laws prohibiting a plurality of wives among their citizens. The Christian Church in that nation were obliged to relinquish the divine institution of polygamy and submit to the Roman laws under heavy penalties. At length, through priestcraft and tradition, the Church was made to believe that the monogamy, established by the Roman civil law, was actually a part of Christianity. This delusion, concocted at the headquarters of the so-called Christian Church, gradually extended itself to the surrounding nations, and other branches of the Christian Church adopted it, and relinquished the polygamic system. The one-wife system did not originate in the Christian Church, but was adopted from the practice of the Roman nation by the Romish priesthood, and by them palmed upon the nations as originating in Christianity. Julius Caesar attempted to have a law passed in favor of polygamy, but could not effect it. The Romans were too much opposed to the practices of Jews and Christians to permit this divine institution to have free tolerance, and the Romish Church followed in the footsteps of their nation, and were unwilling to have this Christian and Jewish practice continued within their ecclesiastical code. Many centuries passed away, during which the common people were not permitted to read the manuscript copies of the Bible for themselves, and they were traditioned by their priests to believe that monogamy was a Christian institution, and that polygamy was forbidden. This delusive tradition was riveted more and more firmly upon the minds of the people by the practices and teaching of each succeeding generation of Christendom, until even whole nations in the Western world were influenced to make laws prohibiting polygamy, as something which tradition had taught them was unchristian. While the world was thus overwhelmed in darkness following the false traditions and superstitions of the Papists, the great reformers, Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, Denis Melanchthon, and numerous other German divines, introduced a wonderful reformation in many things, among which they re-established the right of their priests to marry, and again permitted the divine institution of polygamy to exist in the Church. Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, one of the principal lords and princes of Germany, wrote to the great reformer, Martin Luther, and to the principal heads of the Reformation, anxiously imploring them to grant unto him the privilege of marrying a second wife while the first wife, his princess, was yet living. Many arguments were urged by Landgrave showing that the practice was in accordance with the Bible and not prohibited under the Christian dispensation. Upon the reception of this information, Luther, who had from the beginning of the Reformation favored polygamy, met in council with the principal Christian divines to consult upon the propriety of granting the request of Lord Philip. After considering upon the subject, they addressed to him a lengthy letter, granting him his request, at the same time earnestly exhorting him to live a virtuous and upright life. The letter commences as follows. To the most serene Prince and Lord Philip Landgrave of Hesse, Count of Katzenlembagin, of Dietz, of Zigenhain, and Nidda, our gracious Lord, we wish above all things the grace of God through Christ. 1. We have been informed by Bucer, and in the instruction which your Highness gave him, have read the trouble of mind and uneasiness of conscience your Highness is under at this present, and although it seemed to us very difficult so speedily to answer the doubts proposed, nevertheless we should not permit the said Bucer, who was urgent for his return to your Highness, to go away without an answer in writing. Then follows a lengthy exhortation to the prince to live a life of virtue as a remedy to promote his health. For say they, if your Highness, after marrying a second wife, were not to forsake those licentious disorders, the remedy proposed would be to no purpose. In the 21st paragraph, they counsel the Landgrave to keep his second marriage a secret from the public at large, and that only a few trusty persons should be present at the celebration. This counsel is as follows, XXI, but after all, if your Highness is fully resolved to marry a second wife, we judge it ought to be done secretly, as we have said with respect to the dispensation demanded on the same account, that is, that none but the person you shall wed and a few trusty persons know of the matter, and they too, obliged to secrecy under the seal of confession. Hence no contradiction nor scandal of moment need be apprehended, for it is no extraordinary thing for princes to keep concubines, and though the vulgar should be scandalized thereat, the more intelligent would doubt of the truth, and prudent persons would approve of this moderate kind of life preferable to adultery and other brutal actions. There is no need of being much concerned for what men will say, provided all goes right with conscience. So far do we approve it, and in those circumstances only by us specified, for the gospel hath neither recalled nor forbid what was permitted in the law of Moses with respect to marriage. Jesus Christ has not changed the external economy, but added justice only, and life everlasting for reward. He teaches the true way of obeying God and endeavors to repair the corruption of nature. Your Highness hath therefore, in this writing, not only the approbation of us all, in case of necessity concerning what you desire, but also the reflections we have made thereupon. We beseech you to weigh them as becoming a virtuous, wise, and Christian prince. We also beg of God to direct all for his glory and your Highness's salvation. The letter closes with these words, May God preserve your Highness. We are most ready to serve your Highness. Given at Wittenberg the Wednesday after the feast of St. Nicholas 1539. Your Highness's most humble and most obedient subjects and servants, Martin Luther, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, Antony Corvin, Adam, John Leving, Justus Winford, Dennis Melanther. This letter is in Melanchthon's own handwriting, as the following testimony clearly shows. I, George Nussbacher, Notary Imperial, bear testimony by this present act, written and signed with my own hand, that I have transcribed this present copy from the true original, which is in Melanchthon's own handwriting, and hath been faithfully preserved to this present time, at the request of the most serene Prince of Hesse, and have examined with the greatest exactness every line and every word, and collated them with the same original, and have found them conformable thereunto, not only in the things themselves, but also in the signs manuel, and have delivered the present copy in 5 leaves of good paper, whereof I bear witness. George Nussbacher, Notary. Having given extracts from the letter written by this Council of Protestant Christian divines permitting and approbating polygamy in their church, we will next give the marriage contract into which the Landgrave and his second spouse entered, and also the oath of marriage administered to them by the Reverend Dennis Melanther, preached to his Highness. The marriage contract of Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, with Margaret de Salle. In the name of God, Amen. Be it known to all those, as well in general as in particular, who shall see, hear, or read this public instrument, that in the year 1540, on Wednesday, the 4th day of the month of March, at 2 o'clock or thereabouts in the afternoon, the 13th year of the indiction, and the 21st of the reign of the most puissant and most victorious Emperor Charles VI. Our most gracious Lord, the most serene Prince and Lord Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, Count of Katzenelnbogen, of Dietz, of Ziegenhain, and Nidda, with some of His Highness's councillors, on one side, and the good and virtuous Lady Margaret de Salle with some of her relatives on the other side, have appeared before me, notary and witness underwritten, in the city of Rothenburg, in the castle of the same city, with the design and will publicly to unite themselves by marriage, and accordingly my most gracious Lord and Prince Philip, the Landgrave hath ordered this to be proposed by the Reverend Dennis Melander, preacher to His Highness, much to the sense as follows, WHEREAS the eye of God searches all things, and but little escapes the knowledge of men. His Highness declares that his will is to wed the said Lady Margaret de Salle, although the Princess his wife be still living, and that this action may not be imputed to inconstancy or curiosity. To avoid scandal and maintain the honor of the said lady, and the reputation of her kindred, His Highness makes oath here before God and upon his soul and conscience, that he takes her to wife through no levity, nor curiosity, nor from any contempt of law or superiors, but that he is obliged to it by such inevitable necessities of body and conscience, that it is impossible for him to save either body or soul, without adding another wife to his first. All which His Highness hath laid before many learned, devout, prudent, and Christian preachers, and consulted them upon it. And these great men, after examining the motives represented to them, have advised His Highness to put his soul and conscience at ease by this double marriage. And the same cause and the same necessity have obliged the most serene Princess Christina, Duchess of Saxony, His Highness's first lawful wife, out of her great prudence and sincere devotion, for which she is so much to be commended, freely to consent and admit of a partner, to the end that the soul and body of her most dear spouse may run no further risk, and the glory of God may be increased, as the deed written with the princess's own hand sufficiently testifies, and lest occasion of scandal be taken from its not being the custom to have two wives, although this be Christian and lawful in the present case, His Highness will not solemnize these nuptials in the ordinary way, that is, publicly before many people and with the wonted ceremonies with the said Margaret de Salle, but both the one and the other will join themselves in wedlock, privately and without notice, in presence only of the witnesses underwritten. After Melander had finished his discourse, the said Philip and the said Margaret accepted of each other for husband and wife, and promised mutual fidelity in the name of God. The said prince hath required of me, notary underwritten, to draw him one or more collated copies of this contract, and hath also promised on the word and faith of a prince, to me a public person, to observe it inviolably, always and without alteration, in presence of the Rev. And most learned masters, Philip Melanchthon, Martin Bucer, Dennis Melander, and likewise in the presence of the illustrious and valiant Eberhard de Van, Councillor of His Electoral Highness of Saxony, Hermann de Malsburg, Hermann de Hundelshausen, the Lord John Feig of the Chancery, Rudolf Schenk, and also in the presence of the most honourable and most virtuous Lady Anne, of the family of Miltes, the widow of the late John de Salle, and mother of the spouse, all in quality of requisite witnesses for the validity of the present act, and I, Balthasar Rand, of Fold, Notary Public Imperial, who was present at the discourse, instruction, marriage, espousals, and union aforesaid, with the said witnesses, and have heard and seen all that passed, having written and subscribed the present contract, being requested so to do, and set to it the usual seal for a testimonial of the truth thereof. Balthasar Rand. These extracts have been taken from the first volume of a work entitled History of the Variations of the Protestant Churches, by James Benign Bossuet. They have also been extensively published in other works. These celebrated Protestant divines and great Christian reformers of the 16th century have thus most clearly decided that the gospel hath neither recalled nor forbid what was permitted in the law of Moses with respect to marriage, and in accordance with these sentiments, they most freely declare to the Landgrave that, Your Highness hath therefore, in this writing the approbation of us all concerning what you desire. And the Reverend Dennis Melander, preacher to His Highness, administered the oath of marriage, and solemnized the nuptial ceremony in the name of God, declaring that to have two wives was both Christian and lawful, while, like Sarah, Lee, and Rachel Abram and Jacob's wives, the most serene Princess Christina, Duchess of Saxony, His Highness's first lawful wife, freely consented and admitted of a partner, as the deed written with the princess's own hand sufficiently testifies. These reverend preachers did not come to a hasty conclusion that polygamy was approbated by the gospel, for Luther, in a sermon which he delivered at Wittenberg for the reformation of marriage in speaking of wives, says, "If they are stubborn, it is fitting their husbands should tell them, if you will not, another will. If the mistress refuse to come, let the maid be called." This sermon was pronounced in 1522, some 18 years before they gave a written permission to the Landgrave to become a Christian polygamist. Hence, it will be perceived that their conclusions in regard to the divine approbation of polygamy were formed after many years' reflection upon the subject. Having proved that the heads of the Protestants' Reformation in Germany approbated polygamy in their church, we will next show that at the same period the supreme head and founder of the Church of England, Henry VIII, was a polygamist. This king, having been married for upwards of 20 years to Catherine of Aragon, became deeply in love with Anne Boleyn, and in the year 1532, he was privately married to her, while Catherine still remained his lawful wife. This second marriage, like that of the German prince, was celebrated in secret through fear of public scandal, for it should be remembered that through the delusive influence of the Romish Church, the most of the people had been tradition to believe that polygamy was unchristian. Hence, it became, in their estimation, scandalous, and those who believed to the contrary, and wished to practice this divine institution, were under the painful necessity of keeping their marriage contracts with their second wives partially secret, only permitting a few trusty friends to witness the same. The king, after having been privately married to Anne Boleyn, his second wife, through fear of being scandalized as a polygamist, sought for a divorce from his first wife Catherine, but the head of the Romish Church would not sanction his proceedings, whereupon the king forthwith proclaimed himself the supreme head of the church and invented new articles of religion, and enforced the same upon the people under the penalty of martyrdom. Some, refusing to acknowledge him as head of the church, were shamefully tortured and put to death. Thus was laid the foundation of the great and popular Church of England, its first celebrated head and founder being a polygamist. It is evident that the more intelligent and learned portion of England considered polygamy perfectly consistent with Christianity, or they never would have confirmed by parliamentary acts the title of supreme head of the church upon their polygamous king. It is vain for the Church of England to say that polygamy is not sanctioned by the gospel, so long as they acknowledge that the very founder and head of their church was a polygamist. Though polygamy is a divine institution, yet both the German and English reformers were not justified, in the absence of an inspired priesthood, in officiating the nuptial ceremonies. Not having the priesthood, they had no authority to officiate in a divine ordinance. Though polygamy was practiced in unrighteousness, under the sanction and approbation of the great Christian divines of the 16th century, yet it proves most conclusively that those divines did sincerely believe it to be just as legal and lawful for a Christian to have two wives as to have one only, and they, no doubt, acted in all good conscience in accordance with their firm conviction. Thus polygamy, after having been abolished for many centuries from the churches of Christendom, was again reinstituted therein by the most celebrated reformers of the 16th century. But they dare not, through fear of scandal, publicly proclaim this divine institution. It remained for the renowned prophet of the 19th century, Joseph Smith, to restore this divine institution in all its original purity to the earth, by the word and commandment of the Most High God. It remained for the inspired apostles and elders of the restored Church of God to publicly announce to all nations the reinstitution of this sacred and Christian ordinance. They do not fear the scandal of the deluded fanatics of an apostate church. They do not tremble to announce in the presence of an apostate priesthood the beauty and holiness of the divine institution of marriage, whether including one or more wives. They are not ashamed to practice and proclaim publicly that which the Protestant divines, though convinced of its righteousness and purity, dare only approbate in secret. But in saying this, we would not boast, neither would we speak disrespectfully of the timidity of those good Christian reformers. They were not sent to restore the Christian Church to the earth with all its heavenly ordinances and principles, and not being sent and clothed with the power of the everlasting priesthood, they could not speak as men having authority. and consequently were timid and afraid of scandal and approbated polygamy privately. This care or prudence was no doubt best, under the strong power of tradition and other circumstances with which they were surrounded. But the times of the restitution of all things which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began are at hand, preparatory to the coming of Jesus Christ, whom the heavens must receive, until the restitution of all things is completed, when he will again be sent to take unto himself his great power, and reign over all people. Among the all things which the prophets have predicted should be restored before the Messiah comes is polygamy. The holy prophet Isaiah predicted that in the day that the cloud and fire should be restored to the earth, as should be manifested upon all the assemblies and dwelling places of Zion, every one in that city should be called holy, and should be beautiful and glorious, and that 7 women would take hold of one man, anxiously imploring him to let them be called by his name, to take away their reproach, at the same time promising that they would be no expense to him, but would agree to eat their own bread and wear their own apparel, if he would only become their husband and let them be called by his name. Thus we see that the Messiah never would come unless polygamy were restored to the Christian Church, for the heavens must receive him until all things are restored, which all the holy prophets have predicted. If any should suppose that this prediction, so far as polygamy is concerned, was fulfilled by the early Protestants, we reply that it is true that the Protestant divines restored polygamy, but in their day, we have an account of only 2 women taking hold of one man, by their approbation, whereas Isaiah says expressly, that it is to be 7 women who are to do this. Therefore, though it cannot but be admitted that the Reformers restored polygamy, yet they cannot claim the honor of having restored it in the full sense of Isaiah's prediction. This honor was reserved for a people who should be called Zion, where all should eventually be called beautiful, and glorious, and holy. The pure and virtuous daughters of Zion will consider it a great reproach to remain single and have no posterity. Hence, their exceedingly great anxiety for husbands, that their reproach may be taken away. They will learn that a woman cannot through her own carelessness or neglect fail to fulfill the end of her creation without bringing upon herself everlasting reproach, as well as condemnation for disobeying the Lord's great and first commandment to multiply. Oh, how different will be their feelings from those now manifested by females traditioned under Papist and Protestant superstitions. Surely there must be some mighty changes and revolutions when all things that the ancient prophets have predicted shall be restored. Polygamy, as well as monogamy, will then be honored by all the heavenly hosts above and by all the nations of the righteous upon the earth, and there will not be so much as a dog to move his tongue against any of the institutions of the Bible.